Good morning. Great to see such a full house here for our CSUN 2024 conference. I think you're going to really enjoy this morning's keynote special featured presentation. How was last night? How did you do? How did you enjoy yesterday? Enjoy your day, get to know folks, get to a lot of sessions. Everybody, go ahead, a little applause would be great. Yeah, awesome. You know, one of the things I heard yesterday from Julia Santiago, our director here, is that we had something like about 120 or so new attendees. That's the most that we've ever had, almost double that we've ever had here for the conference. So that says an awful lot about what we're doing here in getting the word out on accessibility, disabilities, and technology. So I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of our conference. In addition to all the wonderful sessions that we have throughout the day, the exhibit hall officially opens this morning at 9:30 a.m. So we want to encourage you to visit new and returning exhibitors. We have over 125 exhibitors this year, so there's an awful lot to experience for all of us. Another reminder that during today's lunch break, we have the Birds of a Feather networking event for those in ICT, or information communication technology, for those that don't know what ICT is or haven't heard of that. Be sure to bring your lunch, enjoy fellow participants, in Platinum Ballroom 9 and 10, which is down the hallway here and over to the right. So we were over there yesterday. We had a wonderful experience on employment that was led by Diane Delaney. This evening, we have some fun planned. Join us for trivia night. It will be at 7 p.m. in the Platinum Ballroom 6, which I think is here, right? Is that where we're at? Right? Yeah, okay. Sometimes I don't know where I am. There are some great prizes, so you won't want to miss it. So this morning we have the first of our daily featured presentations. So there'll be one this morning, one tomorrow morning, and then one on Friday morning. Kate Kalsevich, our speaker this morning, is from Fable, and she's going to discuss key performance indicator, or KPIs, for accessibility, which provide organizations with a quantifiable and measurable way to track progress in making digital products accessible. Kate, thank you for coming.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely that so many of you got up so early after, I'm sure, what was a late night for everyone. So I appreciate you all being here. My name is Kate Kalsevich. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm the head of accessibility innovation. And that's an interesting job title. I feel like I might be the only person in the world with that job title, and I'm very proud of it. So let's kick this off. So we're going to have fun. Don't let the fact that I'm talking about KPIs make you think that this is going to be boring. It's going to be fun, interesting. There'll be examples. I'm going to tell stories. And we're going to make it interactive. So I have set up a Slido. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, Slido allows you to do polls and enter questions. So it's a way we're going to be able to do Q&A that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do based on the size of this room. So the way it works is you would go to slido.com, slido.com on your phone, and you're going to enter in the event code KPIs, so KPIs, plural. And I'll bring it up again when I get to the polls for anyone who comes in late. And so we'll be able to do questions. I'm going to ask you some questions, you can ask me some questions, and we'll make this a bit more interactive. What I'm going to talk about today, 5 things. How my career shaped my thinking in a shift from accessibility auditing and compliance over to KPIs to measure progress. What are the challenges in measuring progress? And what are the opportunities that we have to center human beings in the work we do on accessibility? I'm going to talk about some KPI frameworks that you can adopt and adapt for your own needs, and give you some examples of what potential KPIs could be. And then we're going to have time for questions and discussion. So let's kick off with a bit about my journey. I'm going to talk about myself. So I identify as female, white, and disabled. I've got 3 photos on the screen here. The first one is a side view of myself. And I've worn hearing aids in both of my ears since I was 6 years old. And this is one of the only photos I have where you can actually see my hearing aids. They're quite small. They live in my ear canal. So I don't have the behind the ear hearing aids that wrap behind people's ears. So they're nice and tiny and they fit in. And because it's a profile view and my hair is pulled back, you can actually see my hearing aids. But for the most part, I have what's considered an invisible disability. But that really shapes my experiences working in accessibility and working with other people with disabilities. And I've learned so much from the disability community, which is going to influence my thinking on KPIs. The second photo, I'm in the middle of a group of people who are all smiling, and we've been awarded an innovation award. It's called the Apex Award. And this was my time in government. So my early career was shaped with 20 years of working in public service. I worked in provincial government, which is similar to state government if you're American, and I also worked federally. And so I really came up in this world where accessibility was about compliance, legal compliance, and the way we did that was we audited and we measured against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so that was my first introduction to accessibility in that kind of compliance-oriented sphere. And so after 20 years of that, I decided it was time for a change, and I left government to join a startup. It's an unusual career move, to say the least. And so now I work at Fable, and that third photo on the screen is me speaking at an event. And so that's something that I do a lot of now. We like to share our approach, our human-centered approach to accessibility. We call ourselves Powered by People with Disabilities. So that has really shaped my thinking as well. So back to that early history of when I worked for the government. I worked in web design. This was well before we had things like UX, or we called people front-end developers. You were just a web designer. 2001 is actually when I started in the government. And I worked on the provincial website, the equivalent of state, and we had to take 26 different departments, all of their web content, which was 15,000 pages, and put it all into one website, which was known as Ontario.ca, so that was the province. And I've got a screenshot here of the homepage of the Ontario government website that I worked on. And we've got a couple folks in the room here who actually work there as well. And so when you're dealing with a massive amount of web content like that, how do you know if you're getting better at accessibility? How do you know if you're doing it well? And so the thinking at the time was very much centered around the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And in fact, it was embedded into law. That was how you measured accessibility. That's how you did accessibility. And so I spent a lot of time, obviously, when you've got 15,000 pages, thinking about how to measure accessibility. And you run into problems like this when you're reporting based on WCAG, which is, what do you do if there's just one page or several pages or certain sections of the site or certain departments that are not accessible? How do you report on that? How do you measure that? Oftentimes, compliance reporting is a yes-no. It's a binary. Either you are accessible or you aren't accessible. And that makes it really hard for leadership to know, are we actually getting better? Are we doing this right? How do we know what gaps that we have in our process, and how do we get better at that? So the image on this screen is a big stack of books. They're all like crammed in together, and I've got an arrow just pointing to one page. For that example, that one page is not accessible, because obviously you can't put a bunch of websites up on the screen, so I'm using books as an analogy here. And then the other challenge we had in government was we were told to audit our own content. Can you imagine a world where the IRS said, you're going to do your own tax audit? It's not necessarily reliable. And I've got a meme up here from the movie Office Space. And the manager in Office Space is saying, if you could just own audit and compliance yourself, that would be great. And so a lot of organizations have that approach where you're going to self-audit your content to see whether it's accessible or not. And then you've got the challenge of, well, who's actually doing that auditing? How much do they know about accessibility? How consistent are you going to be across an organization when you have all these different people potentially auditing? Or even if you have just one person auditing one year, and then maybe somebody else is auditing next year. So those are the challenges with that compliance-focused approach to accessibility. It's really hard to know, what parts of your product or your website are not accessible, and are you actually even getting an accurate picture of that? And so because I have this lens of digital, mostly I'll be talking about KPIs in that context, but I'll also try to bring in some examples of other types of accessibility KPIs in the real world. So this is my first question for you. And of course, we have to have a little bit of technical difficulty. So if you haven't yet, go to slido.com. And I'm going to get this running. Patient. I've got a backup. I've got it on my phone. Yeah, I come prepared. I've done this before. Okay. So we won't necessarily be able to see it on screen. But if folks fill out the poll, and I can see people are coming in, we got 28 people saying yes at 77%, and no sitting around 13%, and a couple people who aren't sure. So the vast majority of organizations are actually auditing against WCAG. So thank you very much for all of the folks who are indulging me in this poll. And I'm going to leave that running so you can keep filling it in. And so after my government experiences, after my provincial government experience, I moved on to a federally mandated organization, Canada Post. So that would be the equivalent of the United States Postal Service here, if you're an American. And my thinking shifted a lot because of the leadership there. We had a great leader in digital who said, those exact concept that I just talked about, well, how do we know if we're getting better if all we're doing is checking against WCAG? And she said, come up with a better way of measuring accessibility and progress, one that I can understand and one that my team can understand. So what we did was we actually looked at if you have a task to do, and I've got a screenshot here of some of the things you can do on the postal app. One of them is tracking parcels. One of them is getting notifications with updates if you're tracking a parcel. One of them for paying duty and taxes that you might owe for items that you're shipping across the border. And another screen is adding solutions for a small business card if you're a business owner who does a lot of mailing of things. And so I was working in this environment which was all about parcels and shipping and mail, and we decided there are very clear tasks that people need to complete. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure whether or not people with disabilities can complete those tasks. And so this is where the story gets a little interesting because I was actually a customer of Fable at that time when I was at Canada Post. And so I was able to engage with people who use assistive technologies, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. But in that case, in case somebody isn't, we measured against screen reader users, screen magnification users, and then alternative navigation. So that might be things like voice control, eye tracking, or just anything that's not using a standard mouse, touch, or keyboard input. So we were able to take these tasks, test them with people using assistive technology, and see if they could actually get them done. And so our metric was task completion. You could either complete a task, track your parcel, or you couldn't. And so we were able to look at a variety of different products and know whether they were successfully usable by people with disabilities. And so we were looking at those key, we called them task flows or user flows, things that people wanted to achieve with your product. And so a lot of organizations, you're either providing products or services that could be to customers, it could be to employees when it comes to accessibility, it could be to students. We have a lot of people in higher education here. And so any kind of task that somebody needs to do, and if this person has a disability, either they can get it done or they cannot get it done. And that's a more outcomes focused than looking at compliance. And so whether you're doing websites or apps in digital, or you're doing things in the real world, you're always going to have some sort of compliance factoring in. So it might be a building code if you're in facilities, or if you have stores as part of what your company does, or schools in that case as well. Or it could be something around human rights or employment legislation and non-discrimination. So instead of focusing on those, which are obviously really important, but when it comes to measuring, they may not be the best metric. And so we were able to take a different approach to reporting. And here I've got two tables. The first table has 2 tasks in it, and then they're rated as to how accessible they are, how easy it is to complete the task, and whether or not it was actually completed. And so we've got some lower scores in the beginning for the first task, sitting around 60% of people using assistive technology able to complete the task, and calling it easy and accessible, how they perceived it to be accessible, as opposed to being accessible to a standard. And then for a second task, even lower numbers, 20% across the board, accessible, easy, and completion. And then we were able to take those numbers back to the team who were working on those tasks and those products, show them exactly what the issues were, and then rerun the testing and see, could we increase those task completion rates? And so the second table, we've got much higher numbers. We've got 80% and 100%. And it was a clear and easy way to make progress rapidly with a very narrow focus on task completion and really achieve some of those positive outcomes that we want to see in accessibility. And so I really started to realize at that point that this was an easier approach than compliance. And I don't want anyone to think I don't like compliance or WCAG. I absolutely do. Standards, laws, all of those things are very important. But they're all tools. And you've got lots of tools in your toolbox. If you want a hammer and a nail, a hammer is your best tool. If all you've got is a pair of pliers, good luck hammering in that nail. And then my experiences at Fable exposed me to many different types of large organizations and working with digital teams to do strategy. So I was developing accessibility roadmaps, and I still do for large organizations. So moving from this, government-focused compliance, moving to the Postal Service, also government, but run more like a business, and then moving into pure private sector business and how teams really operate, digital product team. It really changed my perspective, and I learned a lot from the teams that I worked with. And one of the things I kept hearing consistently was, we can only do so many things at once. If you try to do all of accessibility and all of compliance all at once, you start to lose people. And that's the thing that accessibility champions need to keep in mind, that you've got to break accessibility down into doable, realistic targets. And that's what the KPIs are going to be all about. So I've talked a bit about my story and my journey and how my thinking shifted. I'm going to go through some more of those challenges. So when it comes to accessibility from an audit perspective, one of the problems are you often aren't doing it frequently enough. So I've got a picture here of a little dog. It's a golden retriever. He's a puppy, and then he's peeking through a door, and then there's another photo of him a year later, because that's the typical, cadence for auditing. It's not something you do monthly. Mostly, I don't think. We're going to have a poll about that in a minute. We'll find out. So if you're just checking for accessibility once a year, are you really getting all the information that teams need to do better? The other problem with auditing is the number of issues you find all at once. And here I have a photo. A couple years ago, there was a big giant ship got stuck in a canal, and there's this tiny little machine trying to dig it out. And that's what teams feel like. When they get an audit back, they're like, we are just a small little team, and you've given us this massive list of things to do. I often hear that an audit will come back with 600 or even 900. And I heard somebody else say yesterday, 400 or 500 issues at a time. If you're an organization and somebody gives you a list of 900 things to do, where do you start? How are you ever going to get that done? So there's definitely a place for audits. If you have a legislative requirement to do an audit, great. They're a great tool, as I said. But when it comes to giving something to a team that they can action realistically, it's probably not the best tool. And then the last photo here, I have one of these in my house. It is light switches. There are 4 of them. They're all on one plate. And literally my husband turns on and off every light every day because he can't remember which light switch turns on which light. And so that's the other problem with accessibility from a compliance angle. It's meant to make things better for people, but it's not a really usability focused. You know, that's not the intent of it. It's more around compatibility, and that user experience is really important. We all know that the outcome that we want is not just somebody telling us that the website is accessible. We want it to be usable. We want to be able to go shopping. We want to be able to book our doctor's appointments. We want to get the outcomes that we want. And that's where you need that user needs focus. And then the other challenge with auditing, so I've got a photo here, an illustration actually, of a person pointing to some web pages, and then on the other side I have calendars representing every day of the month. 3 of them are highlighted and the rest of them are not. Because in theory, auditing, it sounds like a good way of benchmarking your progress, but the effort required and the time involved in auditing and the infrequent cadence of it is a challenge. I would literally sometimes spend 3 months trying to get all of the departments to audit and send in their audit results to me and try to compile that all into one. And you'll have the same challenge if you work with a vendor to audit. Oftentimes you've got to do the procurement, get the vendor, send them all your content, work out the details of what's being audited, wait for them to finish it, it comes back, and already a quarter of your year is gone. So lots of challenges with that approach as far as measuring progress. So I'm going to pull up another poll here. I'm curious to know, for all those folks who are auditing, what is your audit cadence? Okay. And so again, if you just joined, you would go to Slido, slido.com, and type in KPIs in the event code, and you can participate in the poll. And feel free to start dropping questions in the Q&A as well. Okay, so what I'm seeing in the audit cadence poll results is the top answer is ad hoc. So people are auditing at random, about 36%. Second is annually at 20%, coming close quarterly at 18%. A bunch of people aren't sure if they audit or how often. And then the lowest number is semi-annually or twice a year at 6%. So thank you. Confirming that, people are, if they're auditing regularly, it's probably annually, but we're seeing a lot of ad hoc, just as needed. And so the other challenge we have with this audit-focused approach is the missed opportunity. This is a screenshot of a website that has light mode and dark mode. It's a split screen of both. This is actually my dad's website, and I added dark mode to it just for this talk because just to be able to show that. And one of the things you start to realize when you're working with people with disabilities is all the things covered in the accessibility guidelines are not always all the things people need. And one of the things I hear a lot from people with low vision is dark mode. It's so much easier on their eyes, so much easier to see. It can also benefit some people who are neurodivergent. And so if you're just strictly focused on looking at accessibility compliance, you're missing that. Another thing you hear when you start talking to users is white space. As a designer with a design background, I always thought more white space was better. And then when you see somebody who's magnifying at maybe 500 or 800%, and they're zoomed in so much, they get lost in the white space. I've had people tell me it's like being lost in a blizzard. They can't orient themselves, find their way back to the text. So definitely challenges with that. And then how do we action the findings? So I've got a screenshot of part of the BPAT template, the VPAT, which is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is often used by the US government to determine whether or not a product is accessible and compliant. And so you've got all of these criteria, and this is just page 12 of 15, there's many more pages to it, and you've got a conformance level and you've got some notes. So how do you, as an accessibility champion in an organization, take this to leadership and say, here's what we need to do, here's what we need to get better at? How does leadership understand a report like this? It's useful for, if you're a vendor for the government, you have to fill one of these out. And so it has a purpose. But when it comes to reporting, it may be not the best tool again. And then the other thing is, when you're doing an audit, I've got a graph here where we've got money on one axis, and then we've got all the stages of design, from planning to design to development to testing and release across the bottom. And so the later you do an audit, the higher the costs are to fix everything that you find. So we often talk about shifting left and doing accessibility earlier. And folks don't audit things before they've been released into production, at least not typically. So you've already developed something, published it, it's live. It's a bit too late to be checking for accessibility. So let's talk a bit about the opportunities here. I've got a quote from Melissa Sape, who's the Global Digital Accessibility Service Manager at Dow, and she's here today. If you see her, say hi. She says, there's a lot of data available, but that doesn't mean that it's all meaningful data. Choose metrics that clearly indicate where you are in relation to your goal. And so that's the focus of accessibility KPIs, knowing where you want to get and where you are and how much further you have to go. So I've come up with 3 categories for accessibility KPIs: product, people, and process. Product being the user experience of people with disabilities, so not a compliance focus. People being the skills needed to make accessible products. And then process, what approaches and tools are teams going to be using? And I've got a photo here of Stonehenge. And so we've got 2 pillars standing up, and across the top of the 2 stone pillars, we have another stone pillar. And if you were to pull any of those 2 pillars out, it's going to fall down. So the 2 pillars are people and process, and they prop up your product accessibility, or your service accessibility in this case. Whether you're talking digital or real life, or services for students, or healthcare accessibility, you need people who are trained in how to provide accessibility. You need processes to support that in order to get an accessible product or service. And so what KPIs let you do is to find gaps in your processes and not just accessibility issues. And that's what we want. That's what we need to get better at this. We need to know what are we not doing well so that we can do it better. So I want you to think about KPIs like a menu. I'm going to go into a lot of different options here. There are going to be more than you can eat all at once. So think about starting with 1 to 3 KPIs, an appetizer, a main, and a dessert. And you'll want to also consider capacity. So whether you just start with 1, maybe that is the appropriate level of capacity for your organization or the team you're working with. You're also going to want to align with culture. So which KPIs you choose to track should align with what your organization cares about and how they work. Some organizations are very much design-led. Others are more engineering-led. So you're going to want to align what you track with that culture. And then you can always add more KPIs over time. You don't have to start with trying to do everything all at once. You want to say, here's our goal for the next quarter or the next year, what we're going to track. We're going to get better at it. We're going to see progress. And then we're going to start looking at other things. And that's how you're going to just make progress in this journey of accessibility over time. So I've got another poll for you. I'm curious to know if anybody out there actually has any accessibility KPIs already. And this one's quiet. It's going to be a bit slower because it's a free text. So I'm going to leave that one open for people to fill in because I'm really curious and interested to know if anyone is actually thinking about this and tracking it. Yep, we've got some coming in. Some people are tracking things like the defect burn rate. A lot of people saying not sure or none right now. Shout out to whoever said AUS, the Accessible Usability Scale. I love that one. That's something that Fable created in order to measure the experience of assistive technology users with a website or an app. All right, let's dive into some of these people KPIs. That's our first category. So what are we going to measure when it comes to people KPIs? So I've got 4 dimensions here. I've got a bit of a graph with a grid with four squares. We've got people skills. We've got time allocated to do accessibility work. We have user needs. And being that it's really important that people who are working on accessibility understand user needs. And then we have a 4th category, which is work. Are they actually doing the work? So you can have the skills, you can have the time, you can understand the needs, but if you're not doing the work, it's not happening, it's not getting done. And so the idea being that you could pick different KPIs that fall into these 4 categories that are relevant to your organization, and know that you probably need to at some point address all of them in order to make progress. And so in this diagram, I also have a radiating circle. It's darker in the middle, getting lighter as we go out, and that's to represent maturity. So if any of you are familiar with accessibility maturity models, which tell you how far you have to go in your accessibility journey, how good you are at doing certain things, you could also align that with your KPIs if you wanted to for reporting purposes. So when it comes to people KPIs, what kind of data? How are you going to collect this information? You can do things like surveys to your team members or leaders of the team. You could do observational studies. If you're in digital, you've got researchers. They know how to study people and how they work. So you could certainly do that with an inward focus, not just an outward customer focus. And you can use things like time tracking in your project management tools. If you're already tracking, how much work and effort goes into building a particular feature, you've already got that, and you just need to extract that data and package it up in a different way. So what are some examples of how you might measure progress? So I've got one example here. 90% of new team members finish accessibility training within 6 weeks. It's just an example. You can adapt that for your own purposes. Maybe it's not 6 weeks, maybe it's higher or lower than 90%. And this applies whether you're doing digital accessibility, customer service accessibility, student accessibility, or assistive technologies for students. You need people who are providing these products and services to be trained. Second one is 60% of digital team members engage with a user with a disability in the past year. And this is really critical. There are organizations that try to do accessibility without talking to people with disabilities. And I've been in that scenario myself. And it doesn't work as well as we would like it to. So you learn over time that you really need to bring the users in. And a third KPI is half of your employees incorporate accessibility into one piece of work by Q3. So again, these are just examples to be adapted of how you may take that framework and do something specific. I can tell you a little story about that. One time I built search filters without user testing. This is back in the early days of the government. And so I was building a search results page. I was front-end developer at that time. And you had the ability to filter the search results on varying different categories. You had the ability to sort. And I did all of the things that you're supposed to do for accessibility. I used native HTML components. I put ARIA in. And I'm like, this worked perfectly. And then I opened up a screen reader and I tried to figure out, does it actually make sense? And I realized I don't know how to use a screen reader. I'm not a screen reader user. I am not qualified to make this decision. And so that moment really shifted my thinking about how important it is to bring users in. Now, how might you report on people maturity to leadership? So I've got some example maturity levels if you're looking at that dimension of time. And so most maturity models have maybe 5 different categories. They're all different depending on which one you choose. So I just picked 4, kind of mashed them up in here. If you are being reactive, that means your team have no time for accessibility. They're just fixing bugs as they happen. If you're more defined, you might have specific time period or a percentage of time allocated for accessibility work. If you're in a managed maturity level, the time spent on accessibility might be tied to the quality of your product. So you actually know, people are working on this, we're getting better products out of it. If you're optimized, you might be able to trace your accessibility bugs to gaps in the process and actually adjust if you're at that highest level of maturity. And so you might report on maturity for a single individual product team. You might do it for a whole department, like your UX department or your engineering department or your marketing department. Or you might do it by organization if you're a really large multi-org type of company. Okay, we're going to move on to process KPIs. So what do we measure here? My 4 dimensions are accessibility issues. So if that's digital or in person or with a service, it can be test coverage. This is really digital in nature, this one. It's about what are those automated tools that you're using to find accessibility issues on a regular basis, and are they running on all of your products and all of your websites and all of your platform? Another dimension is user testing. And so this is not the outcome of user testing, but whether you're doing it, where you're doing it in the product lifecycle, and how frequently you're doing it. And then lastly, design system. When we're thinking about digital, having design system coverage, meaning all of your products are using your design system, or all of your design system has accessibility incorporated into it, or both of those things. And those 4 things are going to really help you figure out, are you doing the right thing to create more accessible digital products? And how might you collect this data? Well, lots of organizations who are building digital products use issue trackers. And if you've got labels for accessibility issues, you can use that to generate report. You might do some internal audits of your tools and your systems so that you've got it documented somewhere. You might have dashboards. If you're using an automated accessibility testing tool, most of them have reports that they generate for you in dashboards. So you can pull data from there. If you're doing user testing, you're going to have research reports on the findings of that. And so those are all the places you can look to collect that data and report up. What are some examples of process KPIs? Well, you might have a goal of a 10% decrease in the number of accessibility issues found per quarter. Again, make up your own KPIs. It's just an example using that framework. 90% of the design system has accessibility documentation. That's another option. Or 80% of new features are tested for accessibility before release. And so you can see how you can take this framework of different ways of thinking about accessibility progress and make it very specific to your organization and things that are going to work for you and your team and things that matter to your leadership as well. And if we think back to that VPAT template or WCAG audit, these concrete numbers and these specific approaches to accessibility KPIs, they're so much more understandable from a human perspective. So I've worked on a design system called Mercury when I was at Canada Post, and it's publicly accessible. You can go to, I believe it's mercury.canadapost.ca. Maybe, but it's easy to find in Google. And so one of the things we did was we added accessibility to all of the components and features there. And I've got a screenshot of the accessibility documentation for, I believe this was our accordion component. And it's just showing how we document accessibility for everything. And so when you have that kind of documentation, you have a design system you're using consistently, it just makes it easier for teams to build. So you've got this process in place to help folks make more accessible products. How might you report on process maturity and leadership? So some examples, if you're just reactive, you have no design system, you're just building components ad hoc as you need them. If you're defined, you've maybe adopted a design system, but you're still adding accessibility to it. If you're managed, accessibility might be embedded and documented. If you're optimized, your design system might be used to innovate and collaborate with others. And so you could report here on a per product basis to say, you know, this product has adopted the design system, that one hasn't, or this one has 50% adoption. You could do it per platform if you've got an iOS, an Android, a web platform, or again, per organization. All right, my last category is product KPIs. So what are we going to measure here? I think it's important to look at compatibility. So is it compatible with assistive technology? And that ties back to my task completion. Can somebody using assistive technology or somebody with a disability complete a task? You could also use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines here. Second dimension is usability. And for that, I like the Accessible Usability Scale. Of course, I'm biased because it's Fable's way of measuring usability for people with disabilities. And it's similar to the System Usability Scale. If anyone's familiar with that, it's a 10-question survey that you ask people about their experiences. We could also look at satisfaction, and this is something I think digital teams don't do enough of, is to tie back to customer satisfaction. So we have metrics like CSAT, a customer satisfaction score. We have things like NPS, Net Promoter Score, so how many people using your product or service would recommend it to somebody else. Or we have a CES, a customer effort score, how hard it is to use your product or service. And so that can give you a sense of the outcomes for your intended audience, the beneficiary of accessibility. You could also look at areas of focus. So I find a lot of teams that are working on accessibility want to focus on a particular feature or a particular component. Like you might just be addressing labels in forms and making sure all of your form inputs are labeled. That would be an example of a particular component focus. You might be focused on a specific assistive technology type. A lot of organizations start with screen readers, and so they want to make their products accessible for screen readers first, and then expand out to other types of assistive technologies or disabilities. So again, you take the framework and you make it work for how your organization is working. You can collect data from user research. That's how you would implement something like the Accessible Usability Scale. Customer surveys is how you get customer satisfaction type metrics. And you might have your project management tool tracking your focus areas, whether that's features, components, or assistive technology type. So what are some examples? We can set a KPI that all new features attain an average AUS, or Accessible Usability Score, of 68 or higher. 68 being the average score for the System Usability Scale, so I use that as a benchmark. You could look at average task completion rate for people with disabilities being at least 80% for any changes that you make in, say, Q2 or whatever quarter you're aiming to get better at. And again, this can be adapted. Let's say you want to make sure 80% of the students who need support in the classroom are getting access to assistive technology, task completion being they've got the assistive technology and they're using it. And you might set another KPI of customer accessibility satisfaction. So not just looking at customer satisfaction overall, but satisfaction with accessibility being within 10% of your average. So if you've got a general customer satisfaction score, you can specifically add some questions around accessibility and compare those two. And you want to see them be pretty close to each other. And on this screen, I have a graph. And it shows the average task completion for screen reader users, screen magnification users, and alternative navigation users. And so I have 100% of the screen reader users able to complete this task, 100% of the alternative navigation users able to complete, but only 50% of screen magnifier. Now, if I average those numbers out, I get an 83% task completion, which is a pretty good number. But when I break it down by assistive technology, I can see I should probably have an area of focus on screen magnification and better supporting people with low vision. And so that's the beauty of a KPI. It can give you some information. I clearly got a gap here for screen magnification. How might I report on that? So if you're reactive, maybe you have no compatibility testing or user testing. And again, you're just doing bug fixes. And if you're defined, maybe you're doing pre-launch testing for accessibility. If you're managed, accessibility is actually part of your product development lifecycle. So you're doing it in the earliest phases, also to the latest. If you're optimized, maybe accessibility is actually driving new features and innovation, which we see with some of the larger organizations like Microsoft and Google, really targeting accessibility as a source of innovation. And so you could report per feature, per product, per audience group. Let's say you're concerned about seniors and accessibility. You could have a report up on that older age category, or by assistive technology category, as we saw. Okay, those are my categories. And at this point, I'm going to dive in and see if we have any questions. And if you have questions and you haven't put them in, definitely pop over to Slido, slido.com, and type in KPIs. And I will try to answer these questions after I have a sip of water. And if anyone doesn't want to stay for the Q&A and grab a coffee, I absolutely understand. Now is a good time to head out because that is the majority of my talk. I'm going to leave my email address on the screen. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm kate@makeitfable.com. Happy to take questions. We also have a social Fable is hosting later today from 3 to 5. It's going to be off the lobby of the Marriott Hotel in the lower level, and I'll be there. So if you want to ask me a question in person, I'm happy to take that. I've got a question, will I make my slides available? I think I'm planning to write an article on this. I can make the slides available for CSUN after the fact, yes. I will answer that. I really want to do more. I want to write like a full white paper on this potentially, but yes, I can make the slides available. Another question, qualitative usability studies have few users. How do you ensure metrics arising from small studies are representing a population? Well, actually, the answer to that, I'm going to say, is you don't need to represent a large population. When you design for outliers, you're going to benefit everybody. And I know a lot of organizations want to see, okay, how many people with disabilities are there? How many people are we going to be helping if we do this? And that's not the point of accessibility. The point of accessibility is to make sure everyone is included. We've got studies from, say, Nielsen Norman Group, where, with 5 users, you're going to find 80% of the issues. So I still think we can fall back on those things that, if you have the resources to do a large study, by all means do it, but most of us don't, especially if we want to be continuously improving and doing more accessibility over time. So by keeping it smaller, it makes it easier and more palatable for teams to make progress. Another question here, in a large organization with a small team responsible for multiple applications, how would you build this approach into workflows? Again, I think you got to think back to the culture of the organization and what matters to leadership. I think teams should not make decisions on KPIs in isolation. Knowing what the org cares about and reporting up on that makes accessibility much more relevant to leadership. You could do something like task completion. So organizations care about whether their customers can use their products or their services. So if you were to target task completion across multiple applications and use user research or surveys to find out that information and report up. I got another question here. We got lots of questions. If I don't answer all of these, the beauty of Slido is that I can answer them after the fact. So if I don't get to your question, do check in on the app later. I will answer the ones that I haven't answered here in writing. So this question says, I've been given pushback about maintaining KPI because it can be used in discovery if we were ever to get sued. How would you respond to that? Honestly, that really is something you have to talk to your legal team about. And I think it's important for accessibility teams that are in a compliance-focused organization to build a relationship with legal. Legal will give guidance based on risk. And then you've got legal risk, but you've also got business risk. And so what legal often doesn't do is give you that business risk. So you've got to be able to marry the two and say, this is what legal said. This is the business risk, and take that up to leadership. So developing that relationship with legal is going to help you make that case. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so maybe a couple more questions here. How does the user's experience with their assistive technology factor in when a user completes a task? For example, a new screen reader user versus an experienced user of the AT, which is a great question. We realize that can be a challenge. So Fable, our organization, has a community of assistive technology users who do user testing, and we do screen for people who have used assistive technology for at least a year or more, because you can run into challenges where, you're right, if somebody's just new to using a screen reader, they don't know how to use their technology, and they won't be able to give you that accurate feedback on whether it's the product that's not working or it's their own lack of knowledge about assistive technology. So I think it's just important when you're doing that user research to collect that data from the participants and understand how long they've used their assistive technology. And you know, when you do a lot of research with people who use assistive technology, you start to get a sense for that too. You can see who's a power user and who isn't. And so it's just important to factor that in. When somebody's more advanced or less advanced or in the middle, that does definitely influence things. But you're probably maybe overthinking, because so many people are just not even tracking that to begin with. Another question says, what part of the software development lifecycle do you do this testing? Research or QA or another step? Ideally, all. In a perfect world, you would do user research, you would incorporate feedback into your design process from users with disability, looking at your prototype. You would make sure your developers are doing maybe automated testing or even sitting in on sessions with users. You would do it in QA, you would do it in production. But the reality is, again, back to your capacity. Where do you have time? Where do you have the resources for this? The earlier you do it, the better. So if you can only pick one thing in the life cycle, I would start with the earliest phase. Because that's where you're going to start to catch things and be able to design and build better products from the start. Okay. Another question is accessible, easy, and completed, referring back to that graph that I had, the table. How do you make this quantitative versus qualitative? Is there a checklist underlying these categories, or is it a judgment call? In the context I was using it, I feel it's maybe not as helpful as just like giving a more generic answer. I think it's important to have both quant and qual metrics. So quantitative task completion, either pass or fail, how many users did the task, how many passed or were able to complete it, how many didn't. Those are your quantitative numbers. Qualitative is, what were the barriers they faced? What is that actual issue that they're having? And what feedback are they giving you about your design? So you can take the two of them, and I think that presents the most powerful story if you're merging your quantitative and qualitative data. Checklist, I guess it depends on your research methodology. So if you're moderating an interview with somebody with a disability, you'll have some guiding questions that you're going to ask them. You could do a survey after that, like the Accessible Usability Scale Survey. So you can marry all these different approaches to come to what works for your organization. All right, I'm going to take one more question here, and then we are going to wrap up. For large software companies, what would be the best cadence for auditing? That's an interesting one, because auditing is so resource intensive, and it's going to really depend on your budget. So whether you're doing auditing in-house, and do you have the skill set, and can you allocate the time for people to do that? Or are you outsourcing it to a vendor? And how much is that costing, and how much budget do you have? Because I feel auditing and compliance reporting is very much tied to legal requirements, you might have a preset audit cadence based on what you're using it for. So for example, in certain regions you have to report annually, or certain regions you have to report every 3 years. So it's really understanding the legislative and the technical requirements in your area. Okay, there are lots more questions. I will keep going through the Slido throughout the day, so please check back in if your question hadn't been answered. And thank you all for coming here. I hope you learned something.